This video contains spoilers. Welcome back to Lore 2 RPG, where we dive deep into gaming's greatest stories. Today, we journey into the painted world of Clair Obscur, Expedition 33, to explore one of the most haunting tales of grief, creation, and the price of letting go. Over the next few hours, we'll uncover the tragic story of the Dessendre family, the mystery of the paintress, and the desperate struggle of Expedition 33 to break a cycle of death that has haunted the floating city of Lumière for 67 long years. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this epic adventure together into a world where art becomes reality and where the boundaries between creation and destruction blur like watercolors in the rain. Chapter 1: The World Before the Fracture. To understand the tragedy that unfolds in Clair Obscur. Expedition 33, we must first understand the world as it existed before everything changed. In an alternate version of early 20th century Paris, magic flows through the very fabric of reality, manifesting through the extraordinary gifts of two opposing factions: the painters and the writers. These aren't ordinary artists wielding brushes and pens, but practitioners of a profound magic that allows them to breathe life into their creations. The painters possess the ability to create entire worlds within magical canvases. These aren't mere paintings on a wall, but living, breathing realities that can be entered and explored. With chroma, the mystical energy that flows through all creation, a skilled painter can imbue their artwork with a fragment of their own soul, giving birth to worlds populated by thinking, feeling beings. These canvas worlds exist parallel to reality, accessible to their creators, but hidden from the mundane world. The writers, their rivals in this cosmic conflict, wield similar power through the written word. They craft entire universes through narrative, breathing life into their stories until fiction becomes reality. The relationship between these two factions has been marked by centuries of conflict, a war fought not with conventional weapons, but with the very power of creation itself. At the center of this magical world stands the Dessendre family, one of the most prominent and powerful families among the painters. Aline Dessendre serves as the head of the Painters' Council, a position that speaks to both her skill and her influence within their society. Her husband, Renoir Dessendre, is equally accomplished in the artistic arts, and together they have mastered the creation of hundreds of canvas worlds, pushing the boundaries of what their magic can achieve. Yet for all their power, the Dessendre are not immune to the dangers of their gift. The ability to create and inhabit these alternate realities comes with a terrible price. Spend too long within a canvas world, and the magic begins to consume you. The line between creator and creation blurs until the artist risks losing themselves entirely, their body withering in the real world, while their consciousness becomes trapped in the painted realm. Aline herself once had to rescue Renoir from such a fate when he became lost in one of his own creations. The experience taught them both the importance of balance, of knowing when to step back from the intoxicating allure of absolute creative control. Aline taught Renoir the discipline required to paint safely, to soar without flying too close to the sun, as she put it. This wisdom would later prove prophetic, though not in the way they could ever have imagined. The Dessendre family was blessed with 3 children, each gifted with their own relationship to the magical arts. Claire, the eldest daughter, proved to be a prodigy whose skills rivaled even her parents. Her talent was matched only by her ambition and her fierce protective instincts toward her family. Verso, their beloved son, possessed great potential as a painter, but found his true passion in music rather than the visual arts. His gentle soul led him to create only one canvas world during his lifetime, a childhood fantasy realm that served as a playground for him and his sisters. Alicia, the youngest of the three, was drawn into dangerous territory. Her naivety made her vulnerable to manipulation by the writers, who saw an opportunity to infiltrate the Dessendre household and strike at one of the most powerful painter families. They cultivated her trust, feeding her lies and slowly drawing her into their influence, setting the stage for a tragedy that would shatter not just the Dessendre family, but reality itself. The canvas world that Verso created in his youth would become the stage for everything that follows. Populated with whimsical creatures like Esquier, a mythical being of immense power but legendary laziness, and the Gestrels, a race of friendly beings who view combat as a form of meditation, Verso's world was intended as nothing more than an innocent escape. The geography he painted included the city of Lumière, a beautiful reflection of Paris itself, surrounded by diverse landscapes and populated by people living simple, meaningful lives. This world contained within it a fragment of Verso's soul, the animating force that gave his creations independent thought and genuine emotion. The inhabitants of this painted realm weren't mere puppets dancing to their creator's will, but genuine beings with their own hopes, dreams, and fears. They lived, they loved, they struggled, and they thrived, all within the confines of a world that existed because a young man wanted to create something beautiful. The Gestrels that inhabited this world developed their own unique culture, viewing battle not as violence, but as a sacred form of expression. Among them, individuals like Monoko would emerge, scholarly in demeanor, but possessing a bloodthirsty spirit that delighted in the challenge of combat. These beings existed in perfect harmony with the painted humans of Lumière, creating a society that was both peaceful and vibrant. The beauty of Verso's creation lay in its innocence. Unlike the complex, often dangerous worlds created by master painters, Verso's canvas was a place of wonder and joy. Children in the real world would grow up hearing stories of Esquier's whimsical adventures, tales that unknowingly described real events happening in a realm just beyond their perception. The legend of Esquier spoke of a being capable of soaring through the heavens and diving deep beneath the sea, possessed of incredible power but famously lazy in its application. As the children of the Dessendre family grew older, their relationship with Verso's canvas changed. Clair, ambitious and focused on her studies and the larger conflicts of the world, eventually outgrew her desire to play in her brother's painted realm. She had more pressing concerns, more important friends, and a growing awareness of the war between painters and writers that would soon consume her life. But for Verso, his canvas remained a source of comfort and inspiration. It represented his creative legacy, proof that even someone who preferred music to painting could create something of lasting beauty. The world he had painted would endure long after he was gone, a testament to the power of imagination and the magic that flows through all things. Little did the Dessendre family know that this innocent canvas world would soon become the center of a conflict that would reshape reality itself. The painted realm that had once served as a playground for children would become a prison for the living and a sanctuary for the grieving. The cheerful inhabitants of Lumière, created to live in peaceful prosperity, would find themselves trapped in a cycle of death and renewal that would stretch across decades. The stage was set for tragedy. The war between painters and writers was escalating. The Dessendre family stood at the center of the magical world's attention, and a young woman named Alicia was about to make a choice that would cost her everything she held dear. The world before the fracture was one of infinite possibility, where the only limits were the imagination and skill of the artists who shaped reality itself. But possibility is a double-edged sword, and the same power that could create worlds of wonder could just as easily unleash destruction beyond imagining. The Dessendres would soon learn that some prices are too high to pay, and some losses too great to accept. The innocent world that Verso had painted was about to become the stage for a story of grief so profound that it would literally tear reality apart. Chapter 2: The Fire and the Fall. The destruction of the Dessendre family began not with magic or warfare, but with something far more mundane and infinitely more tragic. On December 33, 1905, a date that would be forever burned into the memory of those who survived it, fire consumed the Dessendre family home. The blaze was no accident, but the culmination of the writers' long campaign against their painter rivals. The writers had spent months, perhaps years, cultivating Alicia's trust. They fed her lies about her family, poisoned her mind against the painter's way of life, and gradually convinced her that she was fighting for a righteous cause. Whether they manipulated her into starting the fire directly, or whether it was the result of her associations with them, remains unclear, but the result was the same. The house that had sheltered one of the most powerful painter families in all of Paris became an inferno. When the flames began to spread through the Dessendre home, Verso faced a choice that would define not just his final moments, but the decades of suffering that would follow. He could have fled, could have saved himself and left his youngest sister to face the consequences of her choices. Instead, he chose love over self-preservation. Racing through the burning corridors, Verso found Alicia trapped by the flames that her own associations had helped kindle. The fire that consumed the house was no ordinary blaze. Infused with whatever dark magic the writers had brought to bear, it burned with supernatural intensity. Verso's rescue of his sister came at a terrible cost. As he carried her from the burning building, the flames seared his flesh and stole his breath. He managed to get Alicia to safety, but the effort proved beyond his strength. Verso Dessendre, beloved son and brother, died from his injuries, leaving behind a family shattered by grief and a sister scarred both in body and soul. Alicia's survival came with its own cruel price. The fire left her horribly disfigured, her face and body bearing scars that would never fully heal. More devastating still was the damage to her voice, leaving her barely able to speak. She had lost her brother, her beauty, and her ability to communicate, all because of her naivety and the writer's manipulation. The guilt would prove almost as consuming as the flames that had taken Verso's life. The immediate aftermath of the fire revealed the depth of the family's devastation. Renoir, who had lost his beloved son, struggled to contain his own grief while supporting his wounded daughter and his inconsolable wife. Clair, driven by fury and a thirst for vengeance, began what would become a lifelong crusade against the writers who had destroyed her family. But it was Aline's reaction that would prove most consequential for the painted world that lay sleeping in Verso's abandoned studio. Unable to accept her son's death, Aline found herself drawn to the one place where Verso still existed in some form. His childhood canvas, with its fragment of his soul embedded in the very fabric of its reality, called to her like a beacon in her darkest hour. Here, in this painted world, she could still sense his presence, could still feel the touch of his creative spirit. The temptation proved irresistible. At first, Aline's visits to Verso's canvas seemed like a healthy form of grieving. She would spend hours walking through the streets of the painted Lumière, marveling at the world her son had created and feeling close to him in a way that seemed impossible in the real world. The inhabitants of the canvas, created by Verso's imagination, welcomed her with warmth and curiosity. They were, after all, extensions of their creator's gentle nature. But as days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, Aline's visits became more frequent and more extended. The allure of a world where she could feel Verso's presence proved stronger than any addiction. She began to neglect her duties in the real world, abandoning her responsibilities to the Painters' Council and to her surviving family members. Her body, sustained by magic, while her consciousness wandered the painted realm, began to show the strain of prolonged canvas exposure. Recognizing that mere visitation wasn't enough to ease her pain, Aline made a decision that would have consequences far beyond her imagining. Using her mastery of the painter's arts, she began to create new inhabitants for Verso's canvas. But these weren't random citizens or fantastical creatures. Instead, she painted perfect copies of her family members, immortal versions who could never leave her again. The painted Verso she created was more than just a copy. It was an idealized version of her son, imbued with his memories and personality, but freed from the mortality that had claimed the original. Alongside him, she painted versions of Renoir, Clair, and even herself, creating a family that could exist forever in the safety of the canvas world. These weren't mere phantoms or echoes, but fully realized beings with their own thoughts and feelings, though always shaped by Aline's grief-stricken perspective. As her painted family took shape, Aline found herself increasingly reluctant to return to the real world. Why face the pain of loss when she could live in a realm where Verso still smiled, still played his music, still filled her days with joy? The painted world became her refuge, and eventually her prison. She began to spend weeks at a time within the canvas, her real body wasting away while her consciousness lived in denial of her son's death. In the real world, Renoir watched his wife's gradual disappearance with growing alarm. He understood grief, had felt the same crushing weight of loss when Verso died, but he also recognized the dangerous path that Aline was walking. The magic that allowed painters to inhabit their canvas worlds was never meant for permanent residence. The human body and spirit weren't designed to sustain such extended separation from reality. Renoir's attempts to reason with his wife proved futile. She had found a way to live with her son again, and no argument about health or responsibility could persuade her to abandon that comfort. As her real body grew thinner and more fragile, Renoir faced a terrible choice. He could allow his wife to slowly waste away in pursuit of an impossible dream, or he could take drastic action to save her life, even if it meant destroying the illusion that had become her entire world. The decision to enter Verso's canvas and forcibly remove Aline was not made lightly. Renoir knew that doing so would mean destroying the painted world that his wife had come to love more than reality itself. He understood that the painted beings she had created, including the idealized version of their dead son, would cease to exist if the canvas were destroyed. But he also knew that losing his wife to madness and magical exhaustion would mean the destruction of what remained of their family. When Renoir entered the canvas with the intention of destroying it and dragging Aline back to reality, he set in motion events that would reshape the painted world forever. His presence in the realm, backed by his own considerable magical power and his determination to save his wife, created a conflict that the painted world had never been designed to contain. The painted version of himself that Aline had created stood in opposition to his goals, defending the grieving mother who had given him life. The painted Verso, torn between loyalty to the woman he saw as his mother and an understanding that her presence was slowly killing her real-world counterpart, found himself caught in an impossible situation. The other inhabitants of the canvas, innocent beings who had done nothing wrong beyond being created by a grieving woman's imagination, suddenly found their world becoming a battleground. The conflict between the real Renoir and the painted defenders of Aline's sanctuary could not be contained within the normal boundaries of the canvas world. The opposing forces, each backed by immense magical power, began to tear at the very fabric of painted reality. What had once been a peaceful realm of wonder began to buckle under the pressure of conflicting intentions and raw magical force. The stage was set for the fracture, the catastrophic event that would split the painted world from its moorings in reality and cast it adrift in an ocean of magical possibility. The innocent inhabitants of Lumière were about to find their world transformed from a peaceful paradise into a realm of annual terror, where death would come each year with the changing of a number on a mysterious monolith. But before we witness the moment that would define the next 67 years of suffering, we must understand the true scope of what was about to be lost. Verso's canvas wasn't just a world, it was a testament to the power of innocent creativity, a realm where joy and wonder could flourish without the corruption of the real world's conflicts. The people who lived there, both the original inhabitants created by Verso and the later additions painted by his grieving mother, had built lives of meaning and beauty. They had families, dreams, ambitions, and hopes for the future. They laughed, they cried, they fell in love, and they created art of their own within the painted realm. Children grew up hearing stories of the mythical Eski, never knowing that their hero was real and lived among them. The Gestrels practiced their unique philosophy of combat as meditation, finding peace through controlled conflict. All of this was about to be swept away by the grief of two parents who could not agree on how to honor their dead son's memory. The fire that had claimed Verso's life was only the beginning of the tragedy. The real destruction was yet to come, and when it arrived, it would transform a world of wonder into a realm of despair that would endure for decades. The painted inhabitants of Lumière were about to discover that even in a world created by magic and sustained by love, death could still find a way to make its presence known. The annual ritual that would come to be known as the Gommage was approaching, though none yet knew its name or understood its terrible purpose. Chapter 3: The Fracture That Broke the World. The event that would come to be known as the Fracture represents one of the most catastrophic magical disasters in recorded history. What began as a desperate husband's attempt to save his wife from her own grief became a cataclysm that shattered the very foundations of a painted world and condemned its innocent inhabitants to decades of suffering. When Renoir entered Verso's canvas with the intention of forcibly removing his wife and destroying the painted realm that had become her obsession, he brought with him not just his own considerable magical power, but also his desperation and his fury. The real world was losing Aline day by day as she wasted away in pursuit of an impossible reunion with their dead son. Her body was failing, her responsibilities abandoned, and her surviving family members left to grieve alone while she chased ghosts in a painted paradise. The painted version of himself that Aline had created stood as the first obstacle to Renoir's mission. This idealized Renoir, crafted from Aline's memories and shaped by her love, possessed all of the original's magical abilities but none of his current desperation. To the painted Renoir, the world of the canvas was perfect, complete, and worth defending at any cost. He saw the real Renoir not as a husband trying to save his wife, but as an intruder seeking to destroy everything beautiful and meaningful. The conflict between the two versions of Renoir was more than just a battle between opposing magical forces. It was a war between two different visions of what love should look like. The painted Renoir represented the desire to preserve and protect, to create a safe haven where loss could never touch those we cherish. The real Renoir embodied the painful wisdom that true love sometimes requires us to accept loss and move forward, even when doing so feels like betrayal. As the two Renoirs clashed within the painted realm, their opposing magical energies began to destabilize the very foundations of the canvas world. The magic that Verso had used to create his innocent fantasy realm was never designed to contain such destructive forces. The careful balance of creative energy that sustained the painted inhabitants and maintained the stability of their reality began to buckle under the pressure. The painted Verso found himself caught in an impossible position. The version of his mother that he knew and loved was slowly dying in the real world, her life force drained by her extended stays in the canvas. Yet the painted world was his home, and its destruction would mean the end of everything he had ever known. The other inhabitants of the realm, the Gestrels and the painted humans of Lumière, looked to him for guidance and protection, not understanding the cosmic forces that were tearing their world apart. The painted Aline, the version of herself that the real Elaine had created as part of her perfect family, became the focal point of the conflict. She possessed all of the original's magical knowledge and power, but her perspective was shaped by grief and denial. To her, the real world represented nothing but pain and loss, while the canvas offered eternal safety and happiness. The thought of returning to a reality where Verso was truly dead was unbearable. As the magical conflict intensified, reality itself began to rebel against the forces being unleashed within it. The canvas world, originally designed as a stable pocket dimension connected to the real world through Verso's soul fragment, began to experience dimensional instabilities. The careful magical framework that maintained the painted realm's existence started to warp and twist under the pressure of opposing wills. The moment of the fracture came when the opposing forces reached a critical threshold. The real Renoir, driven by desperation and love for his wife, channeled every ounce of his considerable magical power into a final assault on the painted realm's defenses. The painted Renoir and Aline, equally determined to preserve their sanctuary, responded with magic of their own, drawing upon the very life force of the canvas world to fuel their resistance. The collision of these opposing magical forces created what can only be described as a dimensional rupture. The painted world, unable to contain the destructive energies being unleashed within it, was literally torn away from its anchor points in reality. The city of Lumière, along with the surrounding landscape and all its inhabitants, was cast into a separate dimensional space, isolated from the real world by an ocean of chaotic magical energy. But the fracture did more than simply relocate the painted world. The traumatic separation from its original dimensional moorings fundamentally altered the nature of the canvas realm. Where once there had been stability and peace, now there was chaos and uncertainty. The magical energies that had torn the world free from reality continued to roil and twist within the painted realm, creating new and dangerous phenomena. The most visible manifestation of this magical upheaval was the appearance of the monolith, a massive stone structure that materialized in the aftermath of the fracture. This was no ordinary monument, but a focal point for the chaotic energies that now defined the painted world. Upon its surface appeared the glowing number 100, a countdown that none of the painted inhabitants understood, but that filled them all with inexplicable dread. The paintress herself emerged as a manifestation of Aline's grief and magical power, transformed by the trauma of the fracture into something far more terrible than the loving mother she had once been. The painted Aline, her consciousness fractured by the dimensional catastrophe, became a towering figure of sorrow and rage, forever painting and repainting the number on the monolith in a desperate attempt to maintain some control over the chaos that surrounded her. The painted Renoir, his opposition to the real Renoir having triggered the catastrophe, found himself trapped at the base of the monolith, his magical power bound by the same forces that had created the structure. From this prison, he could observe the slow destruction of the world he had fought to protect, powerless to prevent the annual ritual that would soon begin claiming the lives of the painted inhabitants. For the innocent people of Lumière, the fracture marked the end of the world they had known and the beginning of a nightmare that would stretch across decades. The cheerful city that had once been their home was cast into an ocean, isolated on a floating island where the sun still rose and set, but where death now came with terrifying regularity. The first Gommage occurred in the year following the fracture, retroactively designated as Monolith Year 100. Those who were 100 years old or older simply ceased to exist, their bodies dissolving into smoke and flower petals as the magical forces unleashed by the fracture claimed their first victims. The survivors were left to cope with losses they could not understand and a threat they could not comprehend. What the painted inhabitants did not know, and would not discover for decades, was that their annual suffering was not the result of some malevolent deity's whim, but a consequence of the ongoing conflict between the real and painted versions of the Dessendre family. The numbers painted on the monolith each year were not a death sentence, but a warning. The paintress was using every ounce of her power to hold back the real Renoir's attempts to destroy the painted world entirely. Each year, as the paintress's power waned under the constant strain of maintaining the painted realm's existence, the real Renoir was able to claim more victims through the Gommage. The countdown on the monolith represented not the paintress's cruelty, but her diminishing ability to protect the people she had come to love as her own children. The painted world had become a prison for everyone trapped within it. The real Aileen was locked in an eternal struggle to preserve a realm that was slowly killing her real-world body. The painted inhabitants lived in constant fear of the annual death sentence that claimed their friends and loved ones with merciless precision. The painted Verso watched helplessly as the innocent world he had created became a realm of suffering and despair. In the real world, the fracture had equally devastating consequences. Clair, already consumed with rage over the writer's murder of her brother, now had to cope with the effective loss of both her parents to the painted realm. Her father was trapped within the canvas, and her mother was slowly dying from the magical strain of maintaining her connection to it. The surviving daughter found herself alone in a world that had taken everything she held dear. The magical community itself was shaken by the catastrophe. The fracture represented a failure of understanding about the true dangers of canvas magic, a reminder that the power to create worlds came with responsibilities and risks that even the most experienced painters had not fully grasped. The sight of an entire painted realm torn free from reality served as a warning about the consequences of allowing grief and desperation to override wisdom and restraint. But perhaps the most tragic consequence of the fracture was the way it transformed love into suffering. Aileen's love for her dead son had created a prison for the living. Renoir's love for his wife had triggered a catastrophe that claimed countless innocent lives. The painted inhabitants' love for their world had made them unwilling participants in a cosmic conflict that none of them understood. The fracture marked not just the beginning of the annual Gommage, but the start of a cycle of expeditions that would stretch across 67 years. The painted inhabitants of Lumière, desperate to reclaim their peaceful existence, would send group after group of volunteers to confront the paintress and end the cycle of death. Each expedition would fail, their members lost to the dangers of the painted continent, until finally, Expedition 33 would set out on what many believed would be their final attempt to break the cycle. The stage was now set for decades of suffering, heroism, and sacrifice. The innocent world that Verso had painted as a playground for his sisters had become a realm where courage and despair walked hand in hand, where heroes would emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, and where the true meaning of love and sacrifice would be tested again and again. The fracture had broken more than just the painted world's connection to reality. It had shattered the very concept of a happy ending, replacing it with a complex web of competing loyalties, impossible choices, and the kind of profound sadness that can only come from love that has been twisted into something unrecognizable by grief and desperation. Chapter 4. The First Expeditions. In the aftermath of the fracture, the painted inhabitants of Lumière found themselves facing a reality they could never have imagined. Their peaceful world had been transformed into a floating island, surrounded by a vast ocean, dominated by the ominous presence of the monolith and its mysterious countdown. The first Gommage had claimed those who were 100 years old, or older, leaving the survivors to grapple with a loss that defied all understanding. The response to this crisis would define the character of the painted world for decades to come. Rather than surrender to despair, the people of Lumière chose to fight back. If the paintress was responsible for their suffering, then she would have to be confronted and stopped, no matter the cost. This decision led to the formation of the first expedition, a group of volunteers who would set out across the dangerous waters to reach the mainland continent where the paintress resided. Expedition Zero, as it would later be known, was unlike any of the expeditions that would follow. The original volunteers had no understanding of what they were truly facing, no knowledge of the cosmic forces that had torn their world apart, and no concept of the painted nature of their existence. They saw themselves as heroes, setting out to save their people from a mysterious threat, driven by courage and determination, rather than the desperate urgency that would characterize later expeditions. Among the members of Expedition Zero were two individuals whose presence would prove crucial to the events that followed. The painted Renoir, though diminished by his conflict with his real-world counterpart, retained enough of his power and knowledge to serve as a guide for the expedition. Alongside him traveled the painted Verso, driven by a complex mixture of loyalty to his people and a growing understanding of the true nature of their predicament. The painted Renoir's motivations were deeply conflicted. As a created being shaped by Eline's memories and love, he possessed an inherent desire to protect the painted world and its inhabitants. Yet he also retained enough of the original Renoir's knowledge to understand that the painted realm's existence was slowly killing the real Aline. His participation in Expedition Zero represented an attempt to find a solution that could save both the painted world and the woman who had created it. The painted Verso's perspective was equally complex. Though he was a copy of the original, he possessed genuine feelings and authentic memories of the world his original self had created. He understood that the painted realm was his legacy and his responsibility, but he also recognized that its current state was a perversion of everything he had intended when he first painted Lumière as a place of peace and joy. Expedition Zero's journey across the painted continent was fraught with dangers that the volunteers could never have anticipated. The fracture had not only torn the world away from reality, but had also destabilized the magical forces that maintained the painted realm's coherence. Strange creatures now roamed the landscape, twisted by the chaotic energies that flowed through the world. The very geography shifted and changed unpredictably, making navigation a constant challenge. As they traveled toward the monolith, the members of Expedition Zero encountered evidence of the painted world's artificial nature. Ruins scattered across the landscape told stories that didn't quite make sense, populated by creatures that seemed more like artistic concepts than natural beings. The painted Verso began to suspect the truth about their reality, though he kept his growing understanding to himself, not wanting to shatter the expedition's morale. The expedition's leader was a woman named Julie, a capable and determined individual who embodied the best qualities of the painted inhabitants. She had lost friends and family members to the first Gommage and was driven by a fierce desire to prevent further losses. Her leadership kept the expedition focused and unified, even as they faced increasingly strange and dangerous circumstances. As Expedition Zero approached the monolith, they encountered the first of many obstacles that would become familiar to later expeditions. The painted continent was guarded by creatures called Nevrons, bizarre beings created by Clair during her brief stays in the painted world. These entities were designed to limit the amount of chroma available to Aline, serving as a check on her power, while also protecting the painted realm from external threats. The Nevrons were not simply monsters to be defeated, but complex beings that reflected Clair's own conflicted feelings about the painted world. Some were clearly hostile, attacking any intruders who approached the monolith. Others were incomplete or failed experiments, shambling creatures that seemed more pathetic than threatening. A few retained enough intelligence to attempt communication, though their words were often cryptic and confusing to the expedition members. The painted Verso's interactions with these creatures revealed his growing understanding of the painted world's true nature. He began to recognize artistic techniques and creative choices in their design, understanding that they were not natural beings, but deliberate creations. This knowledge deepened his sense of responsibility for the expedition's mission while also increasing his awareness of the complex family dynamics that had led to their world's current state. Expedition. Zero's approach to the monolith was marked by a series of increasingly strange encounters. The landscape around the great structure was twisted and unnatural, reflecting the chaotic magical forces that emanated from within. The very air seemed thick with sorrow and rage, emotions so powerful that they had begun to take on physical form. When they finally reached the monolith itself, Expedition Zero discovered that gaining entry was far more difficult than they had anticipated. The structure was protected by barriers of pure magical energy, defenses that had been erected not to keep intruders out, but to contain the devastating forces within. The painted Aline, transformed into the paintress, was locked in an eternal struggle with the real Renoir, their conflict so intense that it threatened to tear the painted world apart entirely. The expedition's first glimpse of the paintress was a moment that would be seared into the memory of anyone who witnessed it. She appeared as a towering figure of sorrow and power, her brush painting and repainting the countdown number on the monolith's surface with mechanical precision. Her eyes held depths of grief that seemed to contain entire universes of loss and regret. To look upon her was to understand, in some fundamental way, the pain that had created their world's current nightmare. Julie's attempt to reason with the paintress ended in tragedy. The expedition leader approached the towering figure with courage and compassion, speaking of the suffering of Lumière's people and begging for an end to the annual Gommage. The paintress's response was not words, but a wave of magical force that scattered the expedition members like leaves in a hurricane. In the chaos that followed, the painted Verso witnessed something that would change his understanding of their situation forever. For a brief moment, the barriers around the monolith flickered, and he caught a glimpse of the real Renoir trapped at its base. The sight of his father's true form, aged and desperate, struggling against magical bonds that held him prisoner, shattered any remaining illusions about the nature of their conflict. The painted Verso realized in that moment that the paintress was not their enemy, but their protector. The numbers she painted each year were not death sentences, but warnings. Desperate attempts to alert the painted inhabitants to the real Renoir's efforts to destroy their world entirely. Each Gommage represented not the paintress's cruelty, but her failing ability to hold back total annihilation. This revelation created a crisis of conscience for the painted Verso. Should he reveal the truth to his companions, potentially destroying their hope and unity, or should he allow them to continue believing in their mission, even knowing that success might lead to their world's destruction? The weight of this knowledge would haunt him throughout the expedition and influence his actions in all the years that followed. Julie's death marked the effective end of Expedition Zero as a unified force. Some members fled in terror, others pressed on with desperate determination, but the cohesion that had carried them across the continent was shattered. The painted Renoir, witnessing the destruction of the expedition he had helped guide, made a decision that would define his role in all future expeditions. Understanding that conventional confrontation with the paintress was impossible, the painted Renoir chose to become a guardian of sorts for the painted world. He would use his knowledge and power to prevent future expeditions from reaching the monolith, not out of cruelty or malice, but out of a desperate desire to protect both the painted inhabitants and the real Aline from the consequences of their conflict. The painted Verso, torn between loyalty to his created father and his growing understanding of the larger situation, eventually made his own choice. Rather than oppose future expeditions outright, he would work with them, guiding and helping them while searching for a solution that might break the cycle without destroying everything he held dear. The remnants of Expedition Zero, who survived the encounter with the paintress, faced a harrowing journey back to Lumière. Many never made it home, lost to the dangers of the painted continent or consumed by despair over their failure. Those who did return brought with them tales that seemed more like nightmares than reality. stories of a grief-mad goddess painting death itself onto reality. Yet even in failure, Expedition Zero established patterns that would define all future expeditions. They proved that the continent could be reached and explored, that the monolith could be approached, and that the paintress, whatever her true nature, was vulnerable to human courage and determination. Most importantly, they demonstrated that the painted inhabitants were not helpless victims, but agents of their own destiny, capable of fighting back against forces beyond their understanding. The return of Expedition Zero's survivors marked the beginning of a new tradition in Lumière. Each year, as the paintress painted a new number on the monolith and the Gommage claimed another group of victims, volunteers would step forward to form a new expedition. They would take the name of the number currently displayed on the monolith, creating a countdown of their own that paralleled the cosmic conflict raging at the heart of their world. The painted Renoir, understanding the pattern that was emerging, began his long campaign to intercept and destroy these expeditions before they could reach the monolith. He told himself that he was protecting them from a fate worse than death, saving them from the terrible knowledge that their world was built on grief and sustained by suffering. But deep down, he knew that he was also protecting the real Aline from the consequences of the truth being revealed. For 66 years, this pattern would continue. Expeditions would form, journey across the continent, and disappear into the wilderness, their members either killed by the painted Renoir's forces or lost to the countless dangers that lurked in the unstable landscape. The painted inhabitants of Lumière would grieve their lost heroes while preparing new ones to take their place, trapped in a cycle of hope and disappointment that seemed destined to continue forever. Each expedition developed its own character and approach to the mission. Some focused on stealth and cunning, hoping to slip past the painted Renoir's defenses undetected. Others embraced direct confrontation, building armies of volunteers determined to fight their way to the monolith through sheer force of will. A few attempted diplomacy, sending small groups of negotiators to reason with the various forces that stood between them and their goal. All of them failed, but not without leaving their mark on the painted world. The continent became littered with the remnants of their passage, abandoned camps, makeshift fortifications, and the graves of heroes whose names would be remembered in Lumière for generations. The painted verso, watching these cycles of heroism and tragedy play out year after year, grew increasingly desperate to find a solution that could break the pattern without destroying everything in the process. The journals left behind by these expeditions became treasured artifacts in Lumière, studied by future volunteers for clues about the continent's geography and dangers. Each journal told a story of courage in the face of impossible odds, of ordinary people choosing to risk everything for the sake of their community. These records would prove invaluable to Expedition 33 when their time finally came. As the years passed and the number on the monolith continued its relentless countdown, the painted inhabitants of Lumière began to develop their own culture around the expeditions. Departure festivals became elaborate celebrations of courage and sacrifice, community events that brought together the entire population to honor those who had chosen to risk everything for the sake of others. The equipment and supplies provided to each expedition grew more sophisticated over time, as the inhabitants of Lumière pooled their knowledge and resources to give their heroes the best possible chance of success. Weapons were crafted with loving care. Maps were drawn and redrawn based on the limited information provided by returning scouts, and provisions were prepared with the understanding that they might be the last comfort these brave souls would ever know. Yet for all their preparation and determination, the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The painted Renoir's knowledge of the continent and his desperate motivation to protect his family gave him advantages that no amount of courage or preparation could overcome. He knew every path the expeditions might take, understood their capabilities and limitations, and possessed magical powers that far exceeded anything the painted inhabitants could bring to bear against him. The painted verso's role in these conflicts grew increasingly complex as the years progressed. His desire to help the expeditions warred with his understanding of the larger picture, creating a web of divided loyalties that would only grow more complicated as the countdown approached its end. He began to work in secret, providing assistance to expedition members when he could, while avoiding direct confrontation with the painted Renoir. As Monolith Year 34 approached and the time came for Expedition 33 to depart, both the painted Verso and the painted Renoir understood that they were approaching a crisis point. The real Aline's power was failing after decades of maintaining the painted world, and the real Renoir's efforts to destroy it were growing stronger with each passing year. Whatever solution could be found would have to be discovered soon, or the countdown would reach its inevitable conclusion with the complete destruction of everything they had all fought to preserve. The stage was set for one final expedition, one last desperate attempt to break a cycle that had claimed the lives of thousands and condemned an entire world to live in fear. Expedition 33 would face challenges that no previous expedition had encountered. Armed with knowledge that previous heroes had died without possessing, and motivated by the understanding that failure would mean not just their own deaths, but the end of their entire world. Chapter 5. The annual ritual of death. The Gommage became the defining ritual of life in the painted world, an annual ceremony of loss that shaped every aspect of society in ways both obvious and subtle. Each year, as the paintress awakened to change the number on the monolith, the inhabitants of Lumière would gather to witness an event that had become as inevitable as the rising of the sun, yet remained as terrifying as the first time it had occurred. The word gommage itself carries connotations of erasure, of being rubbed out like a mistake on a piece of paper. This linguistic choice reflects the painted world's unconscious understanding of its own nature, even though the inhabitants themselves remained unaware of their status as artistic creations. To be erased was not merely to die, but to be removed from existence so completely that even the memory of the victim began to fade from the world. The ritual always began in the same way. The paintress, her towering form visible from anywhere in Lumière, would stir from her year-long slumber atop the monolith. Her movement was like the awakening of a mountain, slow and inexorable, accompanied by tremors that could be felt throughout the painted world. The very air would grow thick with magical energy, charged with grief and determination in equal measure. As the paintress raised her massive brush, dipped in paint that seemed to be composed of liquid sorrow itself, the inhabitants of Lumière would hold their breath. They knew that within moments, friends, family members and loved ones would begin to disappear, their bodies dissolving into smoke and flower petals as the magical forces of the Gommage claimed them. Yet still they watched, unable to look away from the cosmic tragedy playing out before their eyes. The painting of the number was always performed with deliberate, careful strokes. Each line was drawn with the precision of a master artist, the paintress's grief-mad consciousness still retaining the technical skill that had once made Aline Dessendre one of the most respected painters in all of Paris. The number itself would glow with an inner light, visible from the floating island of Lumière, even across the vast expanse of ocean that separated them from the monolith. As the final stroke was completed, the Gommage would begin. Those whose age matched the newly painted number would simply cease to exist, their bodies breaking apart into constituent elements that would drift away on the wind like the remnants of a funeral pyre. The process was instantaneous and painless, but for the survivors watching their loved ones disappear, the emotional impact was devastating. The aftermath of each Gommage was marked by a profound silence that would fall over Lumière like a burial shroud. Families would stand in empty spaces where their relatives had been moments before, struggling to comprehend a loss that defied all natural understanding. Children would call for parents who were no longer there. Elderly couples would reach for partners who had been erased from existence. And friends would struggle to remember the faces of those who had vanished. But perhaps the most cruel aspect of the Gommage was the way it affected memory itself. The magical forces that erased the victims also began to fade their presence from the recollections of those who survived. Photographs would blur, written records would become illegible, and even the strongest memories would begin to dim and fade. It was as if the painted world itself was forgetting that these people had ever existed. This gradual erasure of memory created a secondary trauma for the survivors. Not only had they lost their loved ones, but they were slowly losing the ability to remember them. Families began keeping detailed records of those who had been claimed by the Gommage, writing down every memory they could recall before the magical erasure could steal even that comfort from them. These memorial journals became some of the most treasured possessions in all of Lumière. The psychological impact of living under the constant threat of the Gommage shaped every aspect of life in the painted world. Long-term planning became difficult when there was no guarantee that the planner would survive to see their projects completed. Relationships carried the weight of knowing that any year might be the last one spent together. Children grew up with an awareness of mortality that was both profound and heartbreaking. Yet the inhabitants of Lumière also developed remarkable resilience in the face of this annual trauma. Communities came together to support those who had lost loved ones, creating networks of care and compassion that helped people survive their grief. Festivals and celebrations took on heightened meaning when every gathering might be the last time certain people would be present. Art, music, and literature flourished as people sought to create lasting beauty in a world defined by loss. The departure festivals that preceded each expedition became elaborate community events that served multiple purposes. They honored the volunteers who were risking their lives for the chance to end the Gommage. They brought the community together in shared purpose and hope, and they provided an outlet for the complex emotions that came with living under the constant threat of magical erasure. These festivals evolved over the decades into sophisticated celebrations that incorporated elements from all aspects of life in Lumière. Artists would create works commemorating both the departing expedition and the victims of previous Gommages. Musicians would perform pieces that captured the bittersweet mixture of hope and sorrow that defined their existence. Families would share stories and memories, preserving the details of their loved ones' lives before the magical forgetting could steal them away. The economic and social structures of Lumière also adapted to the reality of the Gommage. Inheritance laws became incredibly complex, designed to handle the sudden disappearance of property owners with no warning. Emergency governance protocols ensured that essential services could continue even if key personnel were erased. Apprenticeship programs were accelerated to compensate for the regular loss of experienced craftspeople and professionals. Marriage and family planning in the painted world required careful consideration of ages and timing. Couples would often plan their relationships around the countdown, hoping to spend as many years together as possible before one or both of them faced erasure. Parents would have children early, understanding that they might not live to see their offspring reach adulthood. Extended families became crucial support networks for children who might be orphaned by the Gommage. The religious and philosophical implications of the Gommage created new forms of spirituality and understanding in Lumière. Some inhabitants came to view their existence as inherently temporary, developing philosophies that emphasize living fully in the present moment. Others searched for meaning in their suffering, believing that their annual losses served some greater cosmic purpose that they could not understand. Mystery cults emerged around the figure of the paintress herself, with some viewing her as a cruel goddess to be appeased, and others seeing her as a tragic figure deserving of pity rather than hatred. These different interpretations of the paintress's nature influenced how different groups approach the expedition tradition, with some viewing it as a holy crusade and others as a rescue mission for a grieving mother who had lost her way. The painted verso, watching these developments from his unique perspective, was deeply moved by the resilience and compassion displayed by the people he had inadvertently condemned to this existence. Their response to the annual trauma of the Gommage revealed the fundamental goodness that he had tried to build into his painted world, even as it demonstrated the terrible cost of the conflict that raged between his parents. As the years passed and the countdown continued its relentless progression, the inhabitants of Lumière began to display what could only be described as a form of collective courage. They understood that their world would eventually reach a crisis point when the number on the monolith could no longer decrease. But rather than despair, they chose to believe that a solution could be found. This faith in the possibility of redemption sustained them through decades of loss and suffering. The children born into this world of annual death developed their own unique perspectives on existence. Having never known a life without the threat of the Gommage, they often displayed a wisdom and compassion that was remarkable for their years. Many of them would grow up to volunteer for expeditions themselves, choosing to risk everything for the chance to create a better world for future generations. The elderly inhabitants of Lumière faced their own unique challenges, knowing that each year brought them closer to the age that would be painted on the monolith. Some chose to spend their final years in quiet contemplation, making peace with their mortality and preparing for an end they could predict with mathematical precision. Others threw themselves into community service, determined to make their remaining time as meaningful as possible. The middle-aged population carried perhaps the greatest burden, serving as the backbone of society, while simultaneously living with the knowledge that their time was limited and measurable. They became the keepers of memory, the preservers of tradition, and the planners of expeditions, carrying the weight of their entire civilization on their shoulders. As Monolith Year 34 approached, and the time came for Expedition 33 to depart, the inhabitants of Lumière understood that they were facing a moment of unprecedented significance. The countdown had reached a point where their youngest expedition volunteers would themselves be at risk during the next Gommage. The margin for error was shrinking, and with it, their hope for salvation. Yet, even in the face of this approaching crisis, the people of Lumière chose hope over despair, courage over surrender. They would send forth their bravest and best one more time, armed with the accumulated knowledge of 66 previous expeditions, and driven by the understanding that failure was no longer an option. The painted world had survived 67 years of annual death, and it would not surrender without one final, desperate fight for survival. The Gommage had shaped them, changed them, and tested them in ways that no people should ever have to endure. But it had not broken them. As they prepared to send Expedition 33 on its journey, the inhabitants of Lumière carried within their hearts the accumulated love and sacrifice of all those who had been erased from existence. They would fight not just for their own survival, but for the memory of everyone they had lost and the hope of a future where children could grow old without fear. Chapter 6: The Heroes of Expedition 33. As the painted city of Lumière awakened on the morning of Monolith Year 33, its inhabitants knew they were facing a moment unlike any in their world's tragic history. The number painted on the distant monolith marked not just another year of the Gommage, but the age of their youngest expedition volunteers. For the first time since the annual ritual of death had begun, the heroes setting out to save their world would themselves be at risk of erasure before they could complete their mission. Gustave emerged as the natural leader of Expedition 33. Though leadership was a burden he had never sought. At 32 years old, he had lived his entire life in the shadow of the paintress's countdown, watching friends and loved ones disappear with each passing year. As an engineer, he had dedicated himself to improving Lumière's defenses and agricultural systems, building and creating while surrounded by an annual reminder of mortality. His mechanical arm, a marvel of painted world engineering, served as both a practical tool and a symbol of his refusal to be limited by the circumstances of his existence. The loss of Sophie had crystallized Gustave's determination to join the expedition. She had been more than just a former lover. She represented all the hopes and dreams that the Gommage had systematically destroyed over the decades. When the latest ritual claimed her, along with everyone else who had reached the age of 33, Gustave understood that waiting for someone else to solve their world's problems was no longer an option. He had 1 year left to live, and he would spend it fighting for a future he might never see. Gustave's practical nature and engineering background made him uniquely suited to the challenges of expedition leadership. While previous expeditions had often been led by warriors or nobles, Gustave brought a builder's perspective to the mission. He understood systems and structures, could improvise solutions to unexpected problems, and possessed the kind of methodical thinking that could turn desperate hope into practical action. Maëlle presented perhaps the most complex case among the expedition members. At only 16 years old, she was significantly younger than the other volunteers, joining not because the Gommage threatened her immediate future, but because she saw the expedition as her chance to finally forge her own destiny. Orphaned at the age of 3, she had spent her entire conscious life as an outsider in Lumière, never quite feeling at home in a world that seemed designed for people with deeper roots and longer histories. Her relationship with Gustave, her foster brother, provided the emotional anchor that had kept her grounded throughout her difficult childhood. He had given her a family when she had none, a purpose when she felt lost, and a sense of belonging in a world that often seemed indifferent to her existence. Her decision to join Expedition 33 was motivated not just by altruism, but by a desperate desire to prove her worth and finally find her place in the world. Maëlle's youth brought both advantages and disadvantages to the expedition. She possessed an energy and optimism that the older members sometimes lacked, unencumbered by decades of accumulated disappointment and loss. Yet she also carried emotional wounds that made her vulnerable to manipulation and doubt. Her visions of the white-haired man and the masked girl would prove to be more than just nightmares, offering glimpses of truths that none of them were prepared to understand. Lune embodied the intellectual approach to the expedition's mission, bringing her skills as a scholar and mage to bear on problems that had stymied 66 previous attempts. Her brilliance was matched by an almost crushing sense of responsibility, understanding that her knowledge and analytical abilities might be the key to breaking the cycle of failure that had claimed so many heroes before them. She had spent years studying the reports and journals left behind by previous expeditions, looking for patterns and clues that might reveal the secret of reaching the paintress. Her magical abilities set her apart from most of the painted inhabitants, representing a level of power that was rare in their world. The source of these abilities remained mysterious even to Lune herself, though she would eventually discover that her magical nature was tied to the artificial origins of their reality. Her spells could burn through obstacles that had stopped previous expeditions, but they also connected her to the larger magical forces that shaped their world in ways she did not yet understand. Lune's determination to unravel the mystery of the paintress went beyond mere intellectual curiosity. She had lost mentors and friends to previous expeditions, watching brilliant minds disappear into the continent's dangers without ever returning with answers. Her participation in Expedition 33 represented not just a research opportunity, but a chance to honor the memory of all those whose questions had died with them. Seal brought a warrior's perspective to the expedition, though her approach to combat was uniquely her own. A former farmer turned teacher, she had learned to find joy and meaning in the simple acts of daily life, even while living under the constant threat of the Gommage. Her warm and outgoing personality masked a deep acceptance of mortality that allowed her to face danger with remarkable equanimity. Her combat philosophy reflected her background in agriculture and education. She understood that violence, like farming, required patience, timing, and respect for natural cycles. Her teaching experience had taught her how to read people and situations, skills that proved invaluable when facing the unpredictable dangers of the painted continent. She could assess threats quickly and respond with just enough force to neutralize them without unnecessary brutality. Shiel's dark and painful past, hinted at but never fully revealed, had shaped her into someone who could find beauty and meaning in even the most difficult circumstances. Her teasing smile masked depths of sorrow that she had learned to transform into strength and compassion. Her presence on the expedition served as an emotional stabilizing force, reminding the other members that their mission was about preserving life and joy, not just preventing death. The expedition was later joined by several unique individuals whose presence would prove crucial to their eventual success. Monoko, one of the few Gestrels who spoke the human language, brought the perspective of a being for whom combat was a form of meditation and competition, a path to enlightenment. His scholarly demeanor disguised a bloodthirsty spirit that delighted in worthy challenges, making him both a valuable ally and a reminder of the painted world's artificial nature. Monoko's immunity to the paintress's influence raised questions about the nature of the gommage that none of the expedition members were yet prepared to answer. As a Gestrel, he existed outside the system that governed the painted humans, suggesting that their world operated according to rules that not all inhabitants shared. His decision to join the expedition was motivated not by fear of death, but by the prospect of facing worthy opponents in glorious battle. Esqui's eventual recruitment represented a turning point for the expedition, providing them with transportation and abilities that no previous group had possessed. The legendary creature's power to soar through the heavens and dive beneath the sea made him invaluable for crossing the ocean that separated Lumière from the mainland continent. Yet his famous laziness meant that convincing him to help required careful diplomacy and negotiation. The myths and legends that surrounded Esqui in the painted world spoke to the inhabitants' unconscious understanding that their reality operated according to different rules than the natural world. A being of such power choosing to remain idle suggested either profound wisdom or tragic resignation. His eventual decision to aid Expedition 33 would prove that even in a world defined by loss and suffering, hope could still motivate action. The dynamics between these expedition members created a group that was greater than the sum of its parts. Gustave's practical leadership balanced Lune's intellectual approach and Ciel's emotional wisdom. Maël's youth and energy complemented the more experienced members' knowledge and skills. Monaco's unique perspective and Esqui's legendary abilities provided capabilities that no previous expedition had possessed. Yet beneath these surface relationships lay deeper connections that none of them fully understood. The bonds between the expedition members went beyond mere friendship or shared purpose, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of family, loyalty, and love. These connections would be tested in ways that none of them could anticipate as they discovered the true nature of their world and their own existence. The expedition's preparation for their journey drew upon 66 years of accumulated knowledge and hard-won experience. They carried weapons forged by the finest craftsmen in Lumière, maps drawn from the reports of previous expeditions, and supplies carefully chosen to sustain them through whatever dangers they might face. Yet their greatest asset was intangible, the accumulated hopes and sacrifices of everyone who had ever fought against the cycle of annual death. As they departed from Lumière amid the celebrations of the festival, the members of Expedition 33 carried with them not just their own determination, but the collective will of their entire civilization. They were heroes, not because they were perfect or powerful, but because they had chosen to stand against despair and fight for a future that seemed impossible to achieve. The painted inhabitants who watched them leave understood that this expedition was different from all those that had come before. The countdown had reached a critical point where failure would mean not just the loss of another group of heroes, but the effective end of hope itself. Yet they also sensed something in these particular volunteers that had been absent from previous groups. A combination of knowledge, ability, and determination that might finally be enough to break the cycle. As Expedition 33 sailed away from the floating island of Lumière, they carried with them the dreams and prayers of everyone they had ever known. They were ordinary people, facing extraordinary circumstances, united by love for their world and determination to save it from the grief-mad forces that threatened its existence. Their journey would take them not just across the dangerous waters to the mainland continent, but into the heart of a family's tragedy that had shaped their entire reality. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the painted world, but the meaning of love, sacrifice, and the price of letting go. The heroes of Expedition 33 would face challenges that went beyond anything their predecessors had encountered, armed with courage that would be tested by revelations that could shatter their understanding of everything they thought they knew about their world and themselves. Chapter 7. The Disaster Expedition. The massacre that greeted Expedition 33 upon their arrival at the dark shores marked the beginning of the end of their carefully laid plans. What should have been a moment of triumph, the successful crossing of the treacherous waters that had claimed previous expeditions, instead became a scene of unimaginable horror as the painted Renoir unleashed 6 decades of accumulated desperation and power upon the latest group of heroes to threaten his family's fragile equilibrium. The attack came without warning or mercy. The white-haired man who emerged from the mists of the dark shores bore little resemblance to the noble father that Aline had painted into her idealized family. This was Renoir transformed by decades of helpless observation, watching expedition after expedition approach the monolith, while knowing that their success would mean the destruction of everything he had been created to protect. His army of monsters, twisted beings born from the chaotic magical forces that permeated the painted world, descended upon the landing forces with terrifying efficiency. The painted Renoir's assault was not random violence, but a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to break the expedition's spirit as well as their bodies. He had studied the reports and patterns of previous expeditions, understanding their tactics, their psychology, and their breaking points. His attack targeted not just their physical capabilities, but their hope itself, demonstrating the futility of resistance against forces beyond their comprehension. Gustave's death during this initial assault would have marked the end of most expeditions, but the bonds that held this particular group together proved stronger than the trauma of loss. His sacrifice to protect Maëlle embodied the selfless courage that had characterized the expedition from its inception, transforming his death from a moment of despair into a catalyst for even greater determination. His mechanical arm, torn from his body during the battle, would serve as a grim reminder of the price of heroism in a world where hope came at such a terrible cost. The survivors of the massacre found themselves scattered across the hostile landscape of the painted continent, separated from their companions and stripped of most of their equipment and supplies. Lune, Ciel, and Maëlle each faced the wilderness alone, forced to rely on their individual skills and determination to survive in a world that seemed designed to destroy them. The painted continent revealed itself to be more than just dangerous. It was actively malevolent, shaped by the chaotic emotions that had torn it from reality decades earlier. Mel's visions during this period of separation provided the first hints of the larger truth that lay behind their world's suffering. The white-haired man and the masked girl who haunted her dreams were not random phantoms, but echoes of real events and real people, fragments of memory and emotion that had become embedded in the painted world's very fabric. Her guilt over some unknown disaster that she could not remember reflected deeper truths about identity and responsibility that none of them were yet prepared to understand. The rescue that came in the form of Verso's intervention marked a turning point, not just for the expedition, but for the painted world itself. His appearance at their moment of greatest need was not coincidence, but the result of careful planning and desperate hope. The painted Verso had been watching and waiting for an expedition that might finally break the cycle, and he recognized in these particular survivors qualities that previous groups had lacked. Verso's decision to reveal himself to the expedition members represented a profound risk for everyone involved. By actively aiding them, instead of maintaining his previous stance of careful neutrality, he was choosing sides in the cosmic conflict that raged at the heart of their world. His intervention would not go unnoticed by the painted Renoir, escalating the conflict between father and son that had been simmering beneath the surface for decades. The recruitment of new expedition members following the disaster at the Dark Shores created a group that was fundamentally different from the one that had departed from Lumière with such hope and celebration. The addition of Verso brought knowledge and perspective that no previous expedition had possessed, while Monaco's presence added combat capabilities that could match the supernatural threats they faced. Esqui's eventual recruitment would provide transportation and power on a scale that had never before been available to the painted world's heroes. Yet the new expedition was also marked by trauma and loss in ways that shaped every subsequent decision and action. The massacre at the Dark Shores had stripped away the naive optimism that had sustained previous groups, replacing it with a hard-edged determination born from intimate knowledge of the stakes involved. These were no longer heroes setting out on a glorious quest, but survivors fighting for their lives and the lives of everyone they had ever known. The dynamic between the original survivors and the new recruits created tensions that reflected the larger conflicts within the painted world. Maëlle's visions and guilt put her at odds with companions who could not understand the nature of her suffering. Lune's intellectual approach to their mission sometimes clashed with Verso's more intuitive understanding of the painted world's true nature. Schiele's acceptance of mortality provided stability, but also highlighted the desperate urgency that drove the others. As the reformed expedition began their journey across the painted continent, they encountered evidence of the 66 expeditions that had come before them. Abandoned camps, makeshift graves, and scattered equipment told stories of courage and sacrifice that stretched back to the very beginning of the annual tradition. Each previous expedition had contributed to the accumulated knowledge that now guided their steps, but also served as a reminder of the overwhelming odds they faced. The painted continent itself had been transformed by decades of conflict and magical instability. The landscape shifted and changed unpredictably, reflecting the emotional turmoil of the cosmic forces that shaped it. Ruins that seemed ancient coexisted with structures that had appeared overnight, created by the chaotic intersection of memory, emotion, and raw magical power. The very ground beneath their feet was unreliable, capable of supporting them one moment and dissolving into nothingness the next. The creatures they encountered on their journey were not natural beings, but artistic concepts given form by the painted world's artificial nature. Some were obvious manifestations of creative imagination, bizarre combinations of familiar elements that could only exist in a realm where art had become reality. Others were more subtle, appearing natural until close examination revealed the telltale signs of deliberate design rather than evolutionary development. The painted Nevrons created by Clair during her visits to the painted world presented particular challenges for the expedition. These beings served multiple purposes within the cosmic conflict, acting as guardians against intrusion, while also limiting the magical resources available to the various forces involved in the struggle. Some were clearly hostile, attacking any intruders who approached their territory. Others seemed confused or incomplete, shambling remnants of failed experiments that posed dangers through their unpredictability rather than their malice. Verso's knowledge of the painted world's geography and history proved invaluable as the expedition navigated these dangers. He understood the artistic logic that governed their environment, recognizing patterns and connections that would have been invisible to beings who assumed they lived in a natural world. His guidance helped the expedition avoid many of the traps and hazards that had claimed previous groups, though it also raised questions about the nature of his knowledge that he was not yet ready to answer. The expedition's approach to the monolith required them to traverse increasingly dangerous and unstable terrain. The closer they came to the source of the painted world's creation and conflict, the more the landscape reflected the cosmic forces that had shaped their reality. Gravity became negotiable. Time flowed in unpredictable patterns, and the very concepts of distance and direction lost their conventional meaning. As they finally reached the barrier that surrounded the monolith itself, the members of Expedition 33 understood that they had achieved something unprecedented. No previous expedition had come so far or overcome so many obstacles. Yet they also recognized that their greatest challenges lay ahead, in the confrontation with forces that had shaped their world for 67 years, and the revelations that would shatter their understanding of everything they thought they knew about their existence. The disaster at the dark shores had transformed them from hopeful heroes into desperate survivors, but it had also forged them into something stronger and more determined than any previous expedition. They carried with them not just their own courage and skills, but the accumulated sacrifice of everyone who had fallen in the struggle against the annual cycle of death. They were the last best hope of the painted world, standing at the threshold of a truth that would either save them all or destroy everything they had ever known. The painted Renoir's massacre had been intended to break their spirit and send them fleeing back to Lumière in defeat. Instead, it had created something he had not anticipated, a group of survivors whose understanding of their mission had been fundamentally transformed by loss and revelation. They were no longer the naive heroes who had departed from Lumière with songs and celebration. They had become something harder, more determined, and infinitely more dangerous to the cosmic equilibrium that had sustained their world's suffering for decades. The disaster at the dark shores had stripped away their illusions about the nature of heroism and sacrifice, but it had also revealed the true strength that lay within each of them. They had faced the worst that their world could offer, and emerged not just alive, but committed to seeing their mission through to whatever end awaited them. The painted Renoir's victory had been Pyrrhic at best, eliminating the expedition's naive optimism while inadvertently forging them into exactly the kind of force that might actually succeed where so many others had failed. Chapter 8. The truth behind the canvas. The revelation that shattered everything Expedition 33 thought they knew about their world came not through dramatic confrontation, but through a quiet moment of recognition in the ruins of an ancient manor. As the expedition members explored the remnants of what appeared to be a great estate, they began to notice details that didn't quite fit their understanding of their world's history. The architecture was too familiar, the artistic style too specific, and the personal belongings scattered throughout the ruins told stories that seemed to echo their own experiences in impossible ways. Clair's appearance marked the beginning of the end of their innocence. The eldest daughter of the Dessendre family materialized before them not as a painted creation, but as a visitor from the real world, her presence bringing with it the weight of truth that could no longer be denied. Her explanation of their true nature as inhabitants of a magical canvas world created by her dead brother Verso transformed everything they thought they understood about their existence, their purpose, and their suffering. The painted world of Lumière, with all its inhabitants and their rich histories, existed within a canvas created by a young man's artistic imagination decades earlier. The fracture that had cast their world into isolation had not been a natural disaster, but the result of a family's grief, tearing reality apart. The annual Gommage that had claimed so many lives was not the cruel whim of a malevolent goddess, but the consequence of a cosmic conflict between parents who could not agree on how to honor their dead son's memory. For the expedition members, this revelation brought both devastating loss and profound understanding. Everything they had believed about their world was simultaneously true and false. Their lives, their relationships, their loves and losses were all genuine experiences that mattered deeply, yet they existed within a framework that was artificial and sustained by magic. They were real people with authentic emotions, living in a world that existed because of a young man's desire to create something beautiful. Maëlle's discovery of her true identity as Alicia Dessendre, the youngest daughter of the family whose tragedy had created their world's suffering, added another layer of complexity to the situation. She was not just a painted inhabitant who had been drawn into the cosmic conflict, but a real person whose consciousness had become trapped within the canvas when she attempted to help resolve her family's crisis. Her visions and guilt were not random phantoms, but memories of real events that her fractured consciousness had been trying to process. The painted verso's reaction to these revelations revealed the depth of his own internal conflict. As a created being imbued with the memories and personality of the original verso, he possessed genuine love for the painted world and its inhabitants, while simultaneously understanding that their continued existence was slowly killing the real Alain. His decades of careful neutrality in the conflict between his painted parents had been motivated, not by cowardice, but by an impossible dilemma that had no clear resolution. Verso's knowledge of the painted world's true nature explained many of the mysteries that had puzzled the expedition during their journey. The artistic logic that governed their environment, the presence of beings like the Gestrels and Eschi, and the way their reality seemed to operate according to different rules than the natural world all made sense when understood as elements of a created artistic vision rather than products of natural evolution. The painted Renoir's desperate campaign against the expeditions took on new meaning in light of this revelation. His violence and apparent cruelty were not the actions of a madman, but the desperate measures of a created being trying to protect the real woman who had given him life. Every expedition he destroyed was an attempt to prevent the truth from being revealed. Understanding that the painted world's discovery of its artificial nature might trigger events that could destroy everything he had been created to protect. The real Renoir's presence at the base of the monolith, trapped and struggling against magical bonds, revealed the true dynamic of the cosmic conflict that had raged for 67 years. He was not the villain of their story, but another victim of the tragedy that had begun with the fire that claimed the original verso's life. His attempts to destroy the painted world were motivated not by hatred, but by love for his wife, whose real body was slowly dying from the magical strain of maintaining her connection to the canvas. The paintress herself, revealed as the painted version of Aline Dessendre, became a figure of profound tragedy rather than simple antagonism. Her annual painting of the countdown numbers was not a death sentence, but a desperate warning, her way of alerting the painted inhabitants to the diminishing time they had before the real Renoir's efforts to destroy their world finally succeeded. Every stroke of her brush was an act of love and protection, even as it brought death to those whose age matched the painted number. The painted world's inhabitants had been living with a fundamental misunderstanding of their situation for decades. The expeditions they had sent out year after year were not heroic quests to slay a monster, but interventions in a family crisis that none of them had the knowledge or power to resolve. Their courage and sacrifice had been real and meaningful, but their understanding of the stakes involved had been tragically incomplete. This revelation forced the expedition members to grapple with questions about the nature of existence and identity that few beings ever have to confront. If they were artistic creations rather than natural beings, did their thoughts and feelings matter? If their world was artificial, were their relationships and experiences less meaningful? If their entire reality existed within the boundaries of a magical canvas, what did concepts like life and death really mean for them? The philosophical implications of their situation were staggering, but the practical consequences were even more immediate and pressing. The real Aline's power was failing after decades of maintaining the painted world, her real body approaching death from the magical strain. The real Renoir's efforts to destroy the canvas and force his wife back to reality were growing stronger with each passing year. The painted world was approaching a crisis point, where the cosmic conflict would reach its inevitable conclusion, regardless of what the inhabitants might want or choose. The expedition's mission had suddenly become far more complex than simply reaching the paintress and ending the Gommage. They now understood that they were participants in a family drama that had been playing out across multiple levels of reality for decades. Their choices and actions would determine not just the fate of the painted world, but the resolution of a grief that had already claimed one life and threatened to destroy an entire family. Clair's explanation of the larger conflict between painters and writers provided additional context for the tragedy that had befallen the Dessendre family. The fire that had killed the original Verso was not a random accident, but the culmination of a war between magical factions, with the Dessendre family caught in the crossfire due to their prominence and power. Alicia's involvement with the writers had made her an unwitting accomplice in her own brother's death, adding layers of guilt and responsibility to an already complex situation. The revelation that the painted world existed within a magical canvas also explained many of the unique abilities and characteristics that had puzzled the expedition during their journey. Lune's magical powers, Maël's visions, and Verso's apparent immortality all made sense when understood as attributes of beings who existed within an artistic creation rather than a natural world. The rules that governed their reality were the rules of art and imagination, rather than physics and biology. Yet this understanding brought with it new responsibilities and new fears. If they were inhabitants of an artistic creation, did they have any agency in determining their own fate? Could beings created by magic and sustained by imagination make meaningful choices about their existence? The painted Verso's decades of careful action suggested that created beings could indeed exercise free will and moral responsibility, but the scope and consequences of their choices remained unclear. The expedition now faced a choice that no previous group had ever confronted. Armed with knowledge of their true situation, they could attempt to break the cycle of conflict that had trapped their world in annual suffering. But doing so would require them to navigate not just the magical and physical dangers of the painted continent, but the complex emotional and psychological landscape of a family's unresolved grief. They were no longer just heroes setting out to save their world from a mysterious threat. They had become therapists and mediators, tasked with helping a grieving family find a way to honor their dead son's memory without destroying themselves or the innocent beings caught in the crossfire. Their success or failure would determine whether the painted world would survive to see another sunrise, or whether it would be consumed by the same grief that had given it birth. The weight of this knowledge transformed the expedition members in fundamental ways. They could no longer approach their mission with the straightforward heroism that had sustained previous groups. Every step forward brought them deeper into a family's private tragedy. Every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond their own survival. They had become unwilling participants in a story that was much larger and more complex than anything they had imagined when they first set out from Lumière. As they prepared for the final stage of their journey to the monolith, the members of Expedition 33 understood that they were carrying the hopes and dreams, not just of the painted world's inhabitants, but of an entire family whose love for each other had been twisted into something destructive by loss and grief. Their mission had evolved from a quest for survival into a search for healing, from a battle against death into an attempt to find meaning in suffering. The painted world that had seemed so solid and real revealed itself to be as fragile as a canvas stretched over a frame. Beautiful and meaningful, but utterly dependent on the continued tension between opposing forces for its existence. The expedition members had to find a way to resolve that tension without destroying the world they loved, a task that would require not just courage and skill, but wisdom and compassion beyond anything they had ever been called upon to provide. Chapter 9: The Monolith and the Final Revelation. The approach to the monolith marked the culmination of everything Expedition 33 had learned and endured during their journey across the painted continent. The massive structure that had dominated their horizon for so long revealed itself to be far more than just a monument or magical artifact. It was the focal point of a cosmic conflict that had raged for 67 years, a prison that contained the warring forces of love and grief that had shaped their entire world. The barriers that surrounded the monolith were not simply magical defenses, but manifestations of the raw emotional energy that had torn the painted world from reality. Love, loss, desperation, and determination had taken on physical form, creating obstacles that could not be overcome through conventional means. The expedition members found themselves facing challenges that tested not just their courage and skill, but their understanding of what it meant to truly care for someone. Lune's suggestion to forge a weapon from the hearts of the axons represented a breakthrough in their understanding of how to navigate the painted world's unique reality. The axons, revealed to be highly dangerous ancient beings created by the paintress herself, contained within their essence the concentrated power needed to pierce the barriers that protected the monolith. Yet obtaining these hearts required the expedition to face beings of immense power and alien intelligence, creatures that embodied aspects of the cosmic forces that had shaped their world. The battle against the axons tested every member of the expedition in ways that previous conflicts had not. These were not merely powerful monsters to be defeated, but living embodiments of the magical principles that governed their reality. Each axon represented a different aspect of the painted world's nature: creation and destruction, love and loss, hope and despair. Defeating them required the expedition members to confront and overcome the very forces that had defined their existence. The forging of the weapon that could pierce the monolith's barriers marked a turning point in the expedition's mission. No longer were they simply trying to reach the paintress through conventional means. They were actively reshaping the magical forces that governed their world. The weapon they created was not just a tool for breaking through defenses, but a symbol of their determination to impose their will upon the cosmic conflict that had claimed so many lives. The interior of the monolith revealed itself to be a realm unto itself, a space where the normal rules of reality held even less sway than in the painted world outside. Here, the expedition encountered manifestations of memory and emotion that had taken on lives of their own. The tainted versions of familiar locations from their journey appeared throughout the structure, transformed by the intense magical forces into twisted reflections of places they had known. The presence of fallen expedition members within the monolith added another layer of tragedy to the structure's nature. The heroes who had died in previous attempts to reach the paintress had not simply ceased to exist. They had been absorbed into the magical matrix that sustained the cosmic conflict. Their courage and sacrifice had become part of the prison that contained the warring forces, their deaths serving to strengthen the very system they had died trying to destroy. The painted Renoir's final confrontation with Expedition 33 took place in an arena where 6 decades of conflict had reached its crescendo. This was not simply a battle between opposing forces, but a culmination of all the pain and desperation that had driven the painted world's protector to commit acts that went against his fundamental nature. The painted Renoir had become a tragic figure, forced to destroy the very expeditions he wanted to protect in order to serve the larger goal of preserving his family. The arrival of the real Aileen during this final battle marked the moment when the cosmic conflict began to tip toward resolution. Her intervention on behalf of the expedition demonstrated that even the paintress, despite her grief-mad obsession with preserving the painted world, recognized the need for the cycle of violence to end. Her command to neutralize the axon that had been protecting the painted Renoir showed that love could overcome even the most desperate protective instincts. The painted Renoir's final defeat was not celebrated as a victory, but mourned as the end of a tragedy that had consumed him for decades. His surrender of control over the canvas to Maëlle represented not just the transfer of power, but the acknowledgement that his long campaign to protect his family had become the very thing that threatened to destroy them. His resignation in the face of inevitable change showed the wisdom that comes from accepting limits and recognizing when love requires letting go. The confrontation with the paintress herself revealed the full scope of the tragedy that had shaped the painted world. Aline Dessendre, transformed by grief and magical power into a towering figure of sorrow, was simultaneously the creator and destroyer of everything the expedition members held dear. Her annual painting of the countdown numbers had been her way of fighting against forces she could not control, her attempt to warn and protect the people she had come to love as her own children. The defeat of the paintress marked not the end of evil, but the resolution of a misunderstanding that had lasted for decades. The painted inhabitants of Lumière had been fighting against their protector, viewing as their enemy the very force that had been struggling to keep them alive. The expedition's victory removed the last barrier between the painted world and the real Renoir's efforts to destroy it entirely, setting up the final confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone involved. The revelation that the numbers on the monolith had been warnings rather than death sentences recontextualized everything the painted inhabitants had believed about their world. The paintress had not been their tormentor, but their guardian, using every ounce of her power to delay the inevitable destruction that the real Renoir's love for his wife demanded. The annual Gommage had been the consequence of her failing strength, rather than her malevolent intent. Verso's letter from Alicia, revealed after the paintress's defeat, provided the final piece of the puzzle that explained the cosmic conflict's true nature. The real Aline had been trying to protect the painted world from her husband's efforts to force her back to reality, understanding that her departure would mean the end of everything and everyone within the canvas. Without her magical power sustaining the painted realm, all its inhabitants would simply cease to exist. The wholesale disappearance of Lumière's population following the paintress's defeat demonstrated the true stakes of the cosmic conflict. The painted world had not been saved by the expedition's heroism, but doomed by their success. Only Verso remained, the last inhabitant of a realm that had lost its magical anchor to reality. The victory that should have brought salvation had instead brought annihilation to everyone the expedition had been trying to save. This revelation transformed the meaning of everything the expedition had accomplished. Their courage and sacrifice had been real and meaningful, but their understanding of the situation had been tragically incomplete. They had succeeded in their stated mission while failing in their ultimate goal, breaking the cycle of annual death by triggering the complete destruction they had been trying to prevent. The appearance of the real Renoir and his explanation of the larger situation provided context for the tragedy, but no comfort for its consequences. His years of imprisonment at the base of the monolith had been spent in desperate struggle against his wife's magical power, trying to save her life by destroying the painted world that was killing her. His love for Aline had driven him to actions that he knew would result in the deaths of innocent beings, a choice that had haunted him throughout his captivity. The real world beyond the canvas, revealed in flashbacks to early 20th century Paris, showed the Dessendre family in their natural environment as prominent members of the Painters Guild. Their magical abilities and social position had made them targets in the ongoing war between painters and writers, leading to the tragedy that had consumed their son and set in motion the events that followed. The fire that had claimed Verso's life had been the opening blow in a conflict that would ultimately consume far more than just one family. The painted world's existence as a canvas within the magical framework of the painter's arts explained the unique rules and characteristics that had puzzled the expedition throughout their journey. The presence of beings like Esquisse and the Gestrels, the way magic flowed through their reality, and the artistic logic that governed their environment all made sense when understood as elements of a created world rather than a natural one. Yet the revelation of their artificial nature did not diminish the reality of the expedition members' experiences or the validity of their emotions. Their love for each other and for their world remained genuine. Their courage and sacrifice retained their meaning, and their determination to protect what they held dear continued to define their characters. They were real people whose reality happened to exist within the boundaries of a magical artwork. The approaching crisis in the real world, as Aline's body failed from the strain of maintaining her connection to the painted realm, added urgency to the need for resolution. The cosmic conflict could not continue indefinitely without destroying both the painted world and the real woman whose grief had created it. The expedition members found themselves facing a choice between accepting the destruction of their world or finding a way to preserve it without condemning Aline to death. The stage was set for the final confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the painted world, but the resolution of a family's grief that had shaped reality itself. The expedition members, armed with knowledge of their true situation and motivated by love for their world and each other, would have to find a way to navigate the competing claims of life and death, reality and art, love and letting go. Chapter 10: The Choice Between Life and Death. The final confrontation that would determine the fate of the painted world took place not in the cosmic battlegrounds where magical forces clashed, but in the quiet spaces where human hearts struggle with impossible choices. Verso's decision to destroy the canvas and free his family from their cycle of grief set up a conflict that went beyond simple questions of survival to explore the deepest meanings of love, sacrifice, and the courage required to let go of what we hold most dear. Maëlle's recovery of her memories as Alicia Dessendre transformed her from a confused young expedition member into a woman grappling with the full weight of her family's tragedy. The guilt she had carried throughout her journey was revealed to be justified. Her associations with the writers had indeed played a role in the fire that killed her brother. Yet her presence in the painted world also represented her attempt at redemption, her effort to make amends for mistakes that could never be fully corrected. The choice presented to the expedition members was unlike any that previous heroes had faced. They could support Verso in his decision to destroy the canvas, accepting the death of their world, but allowing the Dessendre family to finally move beyond their grief. Or they could stand with Maëlle in her desire to preserve the painted realm, saving their world, but perpetuating the cycle of sorrow that had already claimed so much. Verso's arguments for destruction carried the weight of decades of observation and understanding. He had watched the painted world's inhabitants live and die under the shadow of cosmic forces beyond their control, had seen the real Aline slowly dying from the magical strain of maintaining their existence, and had come to understand that true love sometimes requires accepting loss. His willingness to sacrifice himself and everything he had known for the sake of his family's healing embodied a form of courage that went beyond simple heroism. The painted world's dependence on the real Aline's life force created a moral dilemma that had no clear resolution. Preserving the canvas meant condemning a real woman to death from magical exhaustion, while destroying it meant ending the lives of countless painted beings who had done nothing wrong beyond existing. The choice forced everyone involved to grapple with questions about the relative value of different forms of life and the responsibilities that creators bear toward their creations. Maëlle's desire to save the painted world reflected her own struggle with identity and belonging. As someone who existed simultaneously as a real person and a painted creation, she embodied the complex relationship between art and reality that defined their entire situation. Her determination to preserve the canvas represented not just love for the painted inhabitants, but her own need to maintain the connections and relationships that had given her life meaning. The philosophical implications of the choice extended far beyond the immediate crisis. If the painted inhabitants' lives were meaningful and their experiences genuine, did their artificial origin diminish their right to exist? Could love that was born from grief ever be transformed into something healthy and sustainable? Was it possible to honor the dead without becoming trapped by the past? The emotional weight of the decision fell most heavily on those who had to choose between competing loyalties and loves. Verso's love for his family conflicted with his affection for the painted world's inhabitants. Maëlle's desire to preserve her newfound relationships warred with her understanding of her family's need for healing. The other expedition members found themselves caught between loyalty to their world and recognition of the larger moral complexities involved. The battle between Verso and Maëlle was not just a physical confrontation, but a clash between two different visions of what love should look like in the face of loss. Verso represented the wisdom of acceptance, the understanding that holding on to what is gone can prevent us from embracing what remains. Maëlle embodied the power of defiance, the refusal to accept that some losses are inevitable or that some relationships must end. The choice of which character to play in this final confrontation allowed players to explore both perspectives fully, understanding the valid arguments and genuine love that motivated each position. Neither choice was clearly right or wrong. Both represented authentic responses to impossible circumstances, different ways of valuing life and relationship in the face of cosmic forces beyond individual control. If the player chose to support Verso, the painted world's destruction came with a sense of melancholy peace rather than tragic defeat. The expedition members faced their end with dignity and understanding, recognizing that their sacrifice would allow their creators to move beyond the grief that had trapped them all. Verso's final moments with Eski and the others carried the weight of a goodbye that had been 67 years in the making. The dissolution of the painted world in the Verso ending was portrayed not as death, but as a kind of release, a return to the artistic ether from which they had been born. The expedition members faded away with expressions of understanding rather than fear, their final gestures suggesting that they had found peace in the knowledge that their existence had served a purpose larger than themselves. In the real world, the Dessendre family's response to the canvas's destruction showed the painful but necessary process of moving beyond grief. Renoir and Aline, reunited after decades of conflict, could finally begin to heal from the loss of their son, without the artificial comfort of the painted world to prevent them from processing their emotions. Their standing together at Verso's grave suggested the possibility of a future built on genuine acceptance rather than magical denial. The Elysia ending offered a different form of resolution, one that prioritized preservation over acceptance, and chose the continuation of the painted world despite its costs. Maëlle's victory in the final confrontation demonstrated that love could indeed overcome the forces of dissolution, that the determination to preserve what we cherish could triumph even over cosmic inevitability. Maëlle's use of the chroma from fallen expeditioners and defeated axons to revive the painted world showed her growing mastery of the magical forces that governed their reality. Her ability to channel the accumulated sacrifice and courage of everyone who had fought for their world demonstrated that even artificial beings could wield real power when motivated by genuine love and determination. The restoration of Lumière and its inhabitants in the Elysia ending came with its own costs and complications. While the painted world survived, the cycle of grief that had created it remained unresolved. Aline's eventual choice to remain within the canvas, slowly dying from the magical strain, perpetuated the very pattern of escape and denial that had caused the original crisis. The transformation of Maëlle's face with paint, mirroring her mother's appearance during her period of canvas obsession, suggested that victory had come at the price of repeating the same destructive patterns that had caused the original tragedy. The painted world's survival was preserved, but the underlying problems that had created its crisis remained unaddressed. Verso's condemnation to remain in a world he longed to leave represented another form of tragedy, the sacrifice of individual desire for collective survival. His painted existence continued, but his dreams of release and his family's healing were deferred indefinitely. The painted world's preservation had come at the cost of trapping its most aware inhabitant in a reality he understood to be fundamentally false. Both endings carried profound implications for understanding the nature of love, loss, and the choices we make when faced with impossible circumstances. The Verso ending emphasized the courage required to let go and move forward, while the Elysia ending celebrated the determination to preserve and protect what we love regardless of the cost. The moral complexity of both choices reflected the game's deeper themes about the relationship between creation and creator, the responsibilities that come with bringing life into existence, and the ways that love can become destructive when it refuses to accept loss. Neither ending provided simple answers or easy comfort, instead asking players to grapple with questions that have no clear resolution. The painted world of Clair Obscur, Expedition 33 served as a meditation on the power of art to both preserve and trap, to comfort and consume. The Dessendre family's tragedy illustrated how creativity can become a form of escape that ultimately prevents healing, while the expedition members' courage demonstrated that even artificial beings can embody genuine virtue and make meaningful choices. The game's exploration of grief and its consequences revealed the ways that love can be transformed by loss into something that serves death rather than life. Yet it also showed that even in the darkest circumstances, the human capacity for growth, sacrifice, and genuine care for others can create possibilities for redemption and healing that transcend the boundaries between real and artificial existence. As the credits rolled on either ending, players were left to contemplate the full scope of the story they had experienced. The painted world of Lumière, whether preserved or destroyed, had served its purpose as a canvas for exploring the deepest questions of human existence. The expedition members, whether faded into artistic ether or preserved in magical amber, had demonstrated that meaning and value can be found even in the most artificial circumstances when they are grounded in genuine love and authentic choice. The complete story of Clair Obscur, Expedition 33, thus became a tale about the power of creation to both heal and harm, the responsibility that comes with bringing life into existence, and the courage required to make choices that honor both love and loss. In a world where art could become reality, and reality could be reshaped by imagination, the most important truths remained unchanged: that genuine relationships have value regardless of their origin, that sacrifice motivated by love can transcend the boundaries of existence itself, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning when to let go. Epilogue: The legacy of painted worlds. The story of Clair Obscur, Expedition 33 resonates far beyond the boundaries of its painted world, speaking to universal human experiences of love, loss, and the complex relationships between creators and their creations. In following the journey of ordinary heroes facing extraordinary circumstances, we witness a meditation on the nature of reality itself and the ways that art can both preserve and transform the human experience. The Dessendre family's tragedy serves as a powerful metaphor for the ways that grief can shape and distort our understanding of love. Aline's retreat into the painted world represents the temptation we all face to escape into comforting fantasies rather than confronting painful realities. Her transformation into the paintress shows how protective instincts can become destructive when they refuse to accept the natural cycles of life and death. Renoir's desperate struggle to save his wife illustrates the difficult balance between respecting someone's autonomy and protecting them from self-destructive choices. His years of imprisonment at the base of the monolith represent the isolation that can result when love becomes a battle of wills rather than a collaboration between equals. His ultimate reunion with Aline, regardless of which ending players choose, suggests that healing is possible even after decades of conflict and misunderstanding. The painted inhabitants of Lumière embody the resilience of the human spirit in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. Their response to the annual Gommage, choosing hope and action over despair and surrender, demonstrates the power of community and shared purpose to sustain us through our darkest moments. Their willingness to send expedition after expedition into danger reflects our own capacity to sacrifice for future generations, even when the odds of success seem vanishingly small. Expedition 33's journey from naive heroism to complex understanding mirrors our own growth as we encounter the moral ambiguities and emotional complexities of adult life. Their discovery of their world's true nature parallels the moment when we realize that our childhood understanding of reality was incomplete, that the world is far more complicated and morally ambiguous than we once believed. The game's exploration of the relationship between painters and writers speaks to broader questions about the role of art and creativity in society. The war between these factions reflects real tensions between different forms of artistic expression and the ways that creative communities can become insular and hostile to outside perspectives. The tragedy that befell the Dessendre family serves as a warning about the costs of allowing these conflicts to escalate beyond reasonable bounds. The magical system that allows painters to create living worlds within their canvas works serves as a metaphor for the power of imagination to shape reality. The painted world's dependence on its creator's life force reflects the ways that all creative works draw upon their author's emotional and spiritual resources. The danger of becoming lost within one's own creations speaks to the risks that artists face when they lose the ability to distinguish between their art and their life. The choice between preserving and destroying the painted world ultimately asks players to consider what we owe to our creations and what our creations owe to us. The verso ending suggests that sometimes love requires accepting loss and moving forward, while the Alicia ending proposes that some things are worth preserving regardless of the cost. Both positions have merit, and the game's refusal to declare one objectively correct reflects the complexity of real moral decision-making. The painted world's status as an artificial creation raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness and identity that become increasingly relevant as our own world grapples with advances in artificial intelligence and virtual reality. The expedition members' genuine emotions and authentic relationships within their painted reality suggest that meaning and value can exist independently of origin or substrate. The technical achievement of Clair Obscur. Expedition 33. As a video game, deserves recognition alongside its narrative accomplishments. The visual design that brings the painted world to life through art direction that genuinely resembles brushstrokes and watercolors creates an immersive experience that supports the story's themes. The musical score's blend of beauty and melancholy perfectly captures the bittersweet nature of a world caught between creation and destruction. The voice acting, particularly in the roles of the Dessendre family members, brings emotional depth and authenticity to characters who could easily have become abstract philosophical concepts. The game's technical performance and attention to detail demonstrate the care and craftsmanship that went into creating an experience worthy of its profound themes. The critical and commercial success of Clair Obscur. Expedition 33 suggests a hunger for video games that tackle serious themes with intelligence and emotional sophistication. The overwhelmingly positive response from both critics and players indicates that audiences are ready for interactive entertainment that challenges them intellectually while providing genuine emotional engagement. The game's influence on other developers and its recognition from industry figures like Hideo Kojima and Neil Druckmann speaks to its significance within the medium of video games. Its demonstration that a relatively small development team can create a work of lasting artistic merit provides inspiration for other creators and challenges the assumption that only large-budget productions can achieve greatness. The cultural impact of Clair Obscur. Expedition 33 extends beyond the gaming community to broader discussions about art, creativity, and the human condition. Its exploration of grief and healing resonates with anyone who has struggled with loss, while its meditation on the relationship between creators and their creations speaks to artists of all disciplines. The game's French origins and its celebration by French political leaders highlight the potential for video games to serve as cultural ambassadors, showcasing the artistic and creative capabilities of their countries of origin. The international success of this distinctly French creation demonstrates that compelling storytelling can transcend cultural and linguistic boundaries. As we look toward the future of interactive entertainment, Clair Obscur, Expedition 33 stands as an example of what the medium can achieve when it embraces its unique capabilities for emotional engagement and philosophical exploration. Its success suggests that players are hungry for experiences that challenge them to think deeply about fundamental questions of existence, while providing the entertainment value that defines great gaming. The complete story of Clair Obscur. Expedition 33 ultimately reminds us that the most profound truths are often found not in abstract philosophical treatises, but in the intimate stories of individuals struggling with universal human experiences. Through the painted world of Lumière and the journey of its brave defenders, we encounter reflections of our own struggles with love, loss, identity, and the courage required to make impossible choices. In a medium often criticized for its emphasis on violence and superficial entertainment, Clair Obscur, Expedition 33 demonstrates that video games can serve as vehicles for exploring the deepest and most meaningful aspects of human existence. It reminds us that art, in all its forms, has the power to help us understand ourselves and our world more clearly, and that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones that lead us not to victory, but to wisdom. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the painted world of Clair Obscur, Expedition 33. The story of the Dessendre family and their tragic creation serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities of love and loss, and the ways that art can both preserve and transform the human experience. If you enjoyed this exploration of gaming's greatest stories, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into the rich narratives that make our medium so special. Until next time, fellow adventurers, keep exploring those epic tales that remind us why we fell in love with gaming in the first place.